You know, in hindsight, Ballas's words here sound almost like advice. Instruction, even. Interesting. Hey all, Siege here, and welcome back to our discussion regarding Albert Entrati, his chimeric twin, and the specifics of his relationship with the Void, as well as what I believe the underlying concept of the story is heading into Warframe 1999, this being Entrati's overall plot. I strongly recommend watching part 1 first, as some of this might be a bit confusing without its context, but in order to make all the pieces fit, the Man in the Wall, the Lotus, Duviri, well, as I see it, Entrati utilized both Eternalism and the Man in the Wall to create his operate, and after going back again with his firebreak tucked away in what he himself refers to as his stronghold, finally makes his own deal with the Man in the Wall to offer a contract to this special Tenno, thereby allowing another entity with the unique abilities the Void presents, without having the influence the Void seems to possess regarding both our Tenno and Entrati himself. Something I believe many missed in a rather subtle interaction during the classroom scene in the New War is presented here.
Quiet down, please.
Did you hear that? The Tenno is confused. Why? Well, because he was just sent back to this very moment. The rest of the children are all acting normally, but our Tenno is bewildered, wondering how they even got here in the first place. It's not just a memory, is what I'm trying to portray, and offers a pretty telling scene to prove it. Eulyria's lesson illustrating the very thing we are experiencing in real time. It makes you even wonder, is this a recording of her going over the lesson? Or is it her actually speaking? While I still feel there's some debate over the number of Tenno within each dimensional system, given this scene during the New War...
Time's up, kiddo. I can save them. All of them. But you have to want it.
It's almost certain that the player character's Tenno is the specific entity who accepted the devil's bargain. And I don't mean Big Bites Pizza and their newest menu item. By accepting the deal, utilizing a hand that would not be familiar to the Tenno given their connection with Margulis would bloom after they returned from the Void, Tenno all over the ship, wherever they were, started to notice unusual abilities, necessary for what was about to befall them in the doomed Zariman colony craft. What they all did with those abilities still remains somewhat of a mystery, and presumably without the context of our Tenno's apparent deal with the Void, it's very possible some of them may have been susceptible to his influence, as shown within the pages of Rel's comic, explaining the isolation of a certain individual as well, the Tenno we come to know as Rel, and his desire to understand what he had seemingly just dealt with, to learn how to neutralize or contain it in some way, making him both unique and useful in the greater struggle against the Void. But we'll get back to him in a bit. This gift, all the Tenno were given, is in my opinion one of the least understood aspects of Warframe's lore, mainly due to how vague and shocking what we're shown actually is. Clearly, there's some information we've either forgot on our own or forced to forget. Information the Void entity appears to even like to play with, seemingly without much interest in allowing us the full picture. Interestingly, it's an issue that Entrati appeared to describe in his own musings regarding the initial encounter.
A sudden nostalgia gripped me. I grasped desperately for memory of a storm just past the fumbling pitch of a child's song. Yet all these thoughts seemed to steal away from my mind like smoke through a vent.
And this memory loss is also something the Drifter experiences in Duviri. But clearly, the most interesting aspect of the scene is obviously the aforementioned Lotus's hand. The same hand, in fact, that appears to be attached to the Lotus in her weakened Eidolon form upon the reveal of her somehow being back on the ship. I think you can even make the case that, aside from the glowing Lotus object within the transference chair, her model seems to exist through her hand, grounded in this reality, having less of a transparent look than the vast majority of the rest of her body, although this does seem to vary based on the cutscene presented. But given the idea of the Duviri paradox and this visual detail, I think we can reasonably consider the idea to be that he brought the hand back when he finally left Duviri. And her resurrection through Archon shards was much more like a rebuilding of the Lotus versus bringing her actual body back. This crystal, I fear, is even of work and design, as she only took on this title after being changed by Ballas. And if that's true, it might also provide a link to Entrati. I'd be remiss to fail to mention that since she's returned after the new war, she's not been the same in temperament, in her frequency of engagement, and in personality. At first I brushed this off, but her words during Lotus Eaters have me seriously questioning if the Lotus we got back is the same one that originally left us, or if something changed within, let's say, the timeline to bring a different variation to us. And if that be the case, who influences her now? Ballas appeared to have the monopoly on that in the past, but was it actually him, or some kind of Orcan technology? Perhaps even technology that could be manipulated by others of his kind? She seems eerily pliable throughout the entirety of the New War saga, most notably to Ballas's whims, strongly insinuating, perhaps, even a level of mind control, and, as a whole, well, makes the Lotus in her current state pretty suspect, but very much in line with this theory. The second idea I want to highlight here is the consistent confliction of personality that Entrati himself exhibits all too frequently. An idea he has stressed over numerous times, something we are clearly meant to take note of. It's even something Lloyd picks up on, and given Lloyd's understanding of what happened, can we also safely assume that he has seen Albrecht in this state before? How would he ascertain that it followed him otherwise? I think this idea is even evident in other areas of the game. Take Duviri, for instance. At some point, datapads very much resembling those seen in the Zariman classroom begin to spring up all over Duviri, each with a familiar-looking multiple-choice questionnaire, but the information presented is strange. Most of it appears to be instructing our drifter in the ways of the Orcan, their beliefs and ideals, and I'm guessing these may have been questions the drifter originally had to answer in other classes during their time aboard the Zariman. But who put them there? And why would answering the questions prompt a response from the Indifference itself, laughing at choices it deems incorrect, and emphasizing a supposedly correct answer with resounding Zata, truth, as we now know it? The Murmur's influence is supposedly blocked from this area, at least according to Teshin, when in what's considered to be a kind of wall in its own right, the Undercroft. On top of this, there are specific tablets where odd things occur. One where the personality who created them can't remember human speak or just outright changes persona within the answer, while others reiterate more of the deal we made. Something that the drifter, the one who actually engages with these tablets, supposedly didn't do and thus shouldn't necessarily have a memory of. Consider as well that an additional presence was introduced to Duviri at the same time these tablets arrived. The Vagabond, another Duviri-themed character, but darker and missing a finger on their right hand, not to mention prone to laughter as well as vanishing when the player character looks away, most notoriously around the very effigy the people of Duviri erected for Albrecht Entrati himself, the Scholar, something his notes in no uncertain terms reinforce. So, who are we to assume brought these, well, tablets largely made of, for lack of a better term, Orcan and Void doctrine? More and more, I'm inclined to believe that it's kind of both of them, embodied through this entity as their third face, and could be the celestial joke the Vagabond seems so elated with himself about. A secret so sinister, one almost doesn't want to consider a possibility, but nonetheless, more and more, becomes an option one can no longer overlook. In the 1996 and 1999 book and film adaptation of the Chuck Palahniuk story Fight Club, we come to understand its mild-mannered protagonist to be struggling deeply from insomnia, as well as an overall dissatisfaction with the world around him. On one of his many business trips, he happens upon another character named Tyler Durden, who by all rights is everything he wishes himself to be. Strong, confident, and willing to speak his mind and stand up for himself. After a few unfortunate incidents, the pair begin an uncharacteristic friendship, which eventually leads to the creation of an underground fight club, having found what the protagonist at least believes to be some meaning within both the camaraderie of the group, as well as the acts of what one might consider a kind of controlled violence, as the combatants willingly end their scuffles the minute the other is deemed unable to fight, whether through their own admission or their physical condition. These ideals, mostly spearheaded by the smooth-talking Durden, lead to other things: vandalism, petty theft, threatening high-ranking officials, societal sacrifices at the altar of what Tyler deems his greater good. It gets so intense that the protagonist is forced to rethink his association with this individual, uncovering what appears to be a very elaborate plot to cripple the nation's, and perhaps even the world's, debt records, essentially setting everyone back to zero, but with most assuredly society-changing consequences, causing at the very least unimaginable chaos. And for the purposes of this video, the correlation here comes in the discovery that he and Durden were always the same person, essentially split personalities. Our protagonist was Tyler from the beginning, but his ailing sense of self in combination with extreme depression and insomnia brought about a fundamental change and allowed all of it to occur without him really knowing until it was too late. Does this sound at all familiar to the plight of Entrati? Something to consider in addition is that, while still disassociated, his rogue personality knew of what he would do should he ever figure things out, and thus installed his own fail-safes amongst his followers, much like the way the man in the wall led the Tenno around in the lead up to as well as the entirety of the new war. I can't help but think that his adversary wouldn't be in a similar position, begging me to ask the question of, well, with our involvement in this plan, are we helping Entrati, or inadvertently, the other? And I really don't think anyone could definitively guarantee that, at least from what I've presented so far, that they could accurately point out which is which. They're either the same person, or Entrati's doppelganger, like ours, can at least momentarily take over the host persona. Before our impromptu journey back to 1999, when we are greeted by the tech rot, Kalimos and Entrati looking very murmur-like, none of the stuff we were seeing in the origin system was occurring. There was no party of your lifetime. There was no tech rot in the orbiter. And according to Lloyd,
Albrecht made it to 1999 in one piece. But that thing is still on his heels. Albrecht rarely smiled after his return from the void. And never like that. I smashed the casket for nothing! It followed him anyway!
there was no indifference, as we understand it at least, in 1999, the place or time where Entrati claims to feel safe. But when we get there, the trip to the back of the subway proves unequivocally that if he wasn't there before, he sure is now, and adds important context to what happens at the end of the scene to make much more sense. Further, during this event, within whispers, I'd say we are shown an ominous figure walk from the top of the escalator toward Arthur, with what's assumed to be the Tenno's influence following what would most assuredly be one of the longest minutes in gaming history, 11:54 to be exact. And given the very real and specific bone dust barrier keeping us from the second floor, one might consider this minute a stolen moment in time, as even our character's presence is shut out from the next 5+ minutes, the effect of the technocyte appearing to take its toll and render the Protoframe unconscious. Why this occurs or what transpired in that time isn't presented, only the very real walk of what we at first believed to be the Albrecht Entrati, our first encounter with him in fact. The supposed forefather of the void, staring right at, much like Kalimos, the focus is, for at least a time, towards the player, not Arthur. Confused? I made a YouTube short a while back questioning this exact concept. The man in the wall visiting my own orbiter before I even logged in, leaving before my player was even able to move, and It really got me thinking about other instances like this. Warframe's ARGs are always fourth wall breaking in some regard, but the one that we've received prior to 1999, this one is much more personal, with Entrati very much appearing to be largely speaking to us versus the character in-game. Not only that, but Warframe's Twitter account has been furiously posting clues, as well as what appears to be a derelict subway, an old Nokia phone sat alone.
Congratulations. If you are hearing this message, you are now the best hope to thwart an existential threat against your species. I do not have time to care who you are or why you stumbled into this unsavory business, but the messages you have decrypted thus far were left intentionally. This was, you are my failsafe against this old dead-end experiment. The solution is simple, but requires the addition of a signal not found in your reality. Unfortunately, our connection will remain interrupted until you cancel the busy signal. All you need to do is hang it up.
First, this sounds really weird, even for Entrati. His voice is strange. But our species? So what is he, or rather, who is talking here, and who is he even speaking to? How does he not know who we are, if this was supposedly for his failsafe? Unless, of course, in at least this part of the ARG, he's not speaking of the Drifter or the Drifter's reality, or the Tennos. We receive a message detailing the fact that whatever entity is driving the unchecked growth and apparent will of the infected from 1999, this thing has infested source code, meaning, by all rights, it's transmissible through digital medium. And given that now Dark Sector exists in its own right in both this world as well as ours, well, is my own playthrough of what I previously assumed was just an older video game subjecting me to this contagion outside the world of Warframe? Entrati is quite clearly petrified by the indifference, but at the same time judged this fear in the calculated stoic mindset of the scientist. And sometimes, scientists are forced to even use themselves in the process. No more, no less than any of the specimens he'd already sent to their own graves as sacrifices upon the altar of this new science, the Void, something acting much closer to the markers of religion, if you ask me, and based on the countless heretical texts and symbols we find located all over his labs. In short, this science may very well have turned to pure mania, using every piece of information he can get his hands on. And it's here where I believe the relevance of Dr. Gordon Freeman and Half-Life come into play, shown quite prominently all over Hallvania Mall. It's no secret the man on the wall seems to mimic the behavior of the G-Man in that game, a somewhat paracausal entity in its own right. And while the argument can be made that the result is referring to Freeman being late and essentially allowing the events of Half-Life to transpire as a result, I think it goes much deeper than that. In fact, I think Entrati, or the Other, is using the Half-Life lore as another form of information, data, trying to learn from what happened in that universe and using it for his own purposes. The concept of Entrati using multiple dimensions in his plan is quite common. First, clearly 1999 is a variation of the Dark Sector universe. It's an alternate dimension for certain, and I think Rebecca even alludes to this, referring specifically to the slightly awkward features of this place. Everything is changed. How? Well, I don't think we have enough information to confirm Entrati had anything to do with it definitively, but more and more, I wouldn't rule it out. In fact, this world being encapsulated as a living source code presented as a video game, makes me really question if somehow this variation, the Dark Sector universe, wasn't assimilated in its entirety. That's what the Technosite does, right? And the infested message, appearing to be able to traverse space, time, and even dimensionality through mere sound.
I wish Lloyd and Otak would visit us more often. The family isn't truly united until the servants have come home. You know where to find me.
Don't put out the flame and run away. In this heartbreak, I'll be here fighting for you with or without you. Wide awake with all the things I know that I should say. I thought I could take more than I really can with or without you. Baby, till you come back with something, I know I'll never let it go. I'm waiting, but you come back with nothing. This obsession is turned into the great despair. I keep thinking I see you and there's nobody there.
I kept thinking that I could see myself at the corner of my eye. The ring light.
So pull me out of the great despair. Every day I'm getting stronger, but I still feel the pain. Time will show the way, and I'm in the heart you've broken with or without you. Baby, till you come back with something, I know I'll never let it go. I know I'll never let go. The difference that you come back with nothing. You come back with nothing. This obsession is turned into the great despair. I keep thinking I see you and there's nobody there. You say love is time, but all your love isn't there. So pull me out of the great despair. Oh, we watch the world burn down around us, but we're still standing here with the flicker of hope on the darkest of days. Now it feels like the end is near. The This obsession is turned into the great despair. I keep thinking I see you. This obsession is turned into the great despair. All I see is you everywhere. They say love is time, and now it's time we declare goodbye to the great despair.
The infested are yearning for Entrati to come back to its time and give it something, willing to keep the fight going until he gets back, centered around this new purpose. In fact, I even wonder if the lines "we watched the world burn down around us" has to do with the pre-Orican radiation wars, something that is also alluded to in Dark Sector, with the key change towards the end most likely signifying the stroke of midnight, where the void-consumed infestation, now active and transmissible via computer source code, audio interaction, and most concerning between timelines and dimensions, spreads Entrati's signal to make it, well, just like the song says, everywhere. I feel like the gravity of this theory is finally reaching its apex, where they began, if you're looking at it from Digital Extreme's perspective, at least when it comes to the Warframe mythos, and in many ways, DE themselves. Personally, I love the concept of including this Matrix-like reality, breaking the fourth wall in its entirety versus subtly nudging it and in ways personifying DE's own struggle in getting this game we all love made in the first place, all while putting everything on the line with each new release. After all, there's a lot of games out there. A bad enough miscalculation could cost them everything they've built up to this point. And it's a risk they've been forced to take every step of the way. What would be so alien in that very concept manifesting within their own storyboarding? I realize this last part may appear to be a bit much, but just remember, the next time you're in Entrati's labs and you see those eyes on the walls, well, don't forget, they're looking at you. No, not your Warframe. Nope, not your Tenno or Drifter. You. Crazy? Well, guess we'll see now, won't we? I can't help but notice one other thing about the void entities. I suppose now that we've been definitively shown two, and presumably its impact on the greater picture. It's so reserved. A trickster for certain, the man in the wall by all accounts never really seems out of his depth. The closest thing to this being his desire for the final page of the grimoire. And even then, when the Tenno decide against said action, his next action, by all rights, is merely to continue with what seems was his original plan from the beginning. Overtake the lab, most likely to reclaim his lost finger and break from what Fibonacci describes as the only thing keeping him tied to this singular reality. Within Whispers on the Walls, we are quite plainly shown the indifferences under the impression that the Cavia are on its side, and given how events play out later with them essentially being reborn by the Void.
The chamber is sealed. Prepare for saturation. I've done all I can. Increasing saturation! Their levels of decay aren't shifting. Pushing to maximum! I'm sorry. I tried. I daren't open the chamber. The radiation in you. I don't know what.
Is there nothing?
We're done, Fish. No point in howling about it.
Just gonna sit down. Will we be like men now?
We'll all get to meet her, Bird. Don't you worry about nothing. You can talk her ear off, and she'll love you for it. Bird? Bird?
Tagfa.
It's not your fault, Fib. We just played the hand we were dealt as best we could. Not your fault. None of our fault. Fib? So long, Fish. Lloyd, you did good.
Bad comedy. Their void contamination levels are dropping. Of course. Huzzah. At least I'll be able to bury... Their contamination levels haven't dropped. They've... alchemized. You were dead.
I guess it didn't take. But there's definitely some weird crap going on with us right now. You want to explain this? We're...
Incandescent. Some kind of chromatic volatility. A side effect of void and anti-void and something I can't quite identify. A reaction that saved your lives, but did that.
I look ridiculous.
We look beautiful.
We look purple.
Not me. I want to be yellow.
Ugh, good grief.
How did he do that?
I wanna be red.
Whoa.
Amazing. Amazing.
I'm still purple.
Everything's green, so everything's clean. Let's get you out of there.
With Lloyd appearing to have little to nothing to do with their survival, we can see the void pulling strings from the shadows. Not to mention Tagfer's burning hatred towards Entrati and Fibonacci's clear distaste for Lloyd. Why are we assuming they aren't serving him? Here's another little known interpretation that needs to be addressed. Bird 1 is almost certainly Bird 3. He's just been somehow revived from the grave multiple times. Another horrific Entrati experiment for his greater good. Dare I say, before it's all said and done, we will come to find out the passage the Indifference continually repeats to us specifically is very likely, do you want to know the truth, Void Child? Because in many ways, I think that's what it's trying to offer us. Well, its interpretation of the truth, at least. Having the Tenno willingly take its part would obviously benefit it greatly. And I already see countless comments in previous videos taking its side. Are they wrong to do so? It could very well be a toss-up given what we know of things. Much of what I believe the visual world building of Entrati's labs is trying to portray is essentially Entrati's personal struggle at this point. The positioning of the chair, it facing a vessel the Void is obviously comfortable with, as well as the circle it resides in, one that is shown to have similar symbology to the first time our operator is confronted by him within this quest. And I believe this is where a communing was enacted, no doubt meant as a means to learn, something Albrecht's scientific mind would greatly value. Probably starting out as him just showing up like he does for us, but Entrati, being a scientist and wanting to understand, would most likely attempt to question it and perhaps even entice it further into deeper communication with offerings. It appears to like, as other vessels within the lab themselves are being groped, restrained, and even pulled under the very sands that make up his lab, seeming to illustrate an affinity Entrati was all too willing to exploit for information. And I think these offerings are what was most likely used to lure the Indifference into his deal and plot. The chess game between the two reaching a level of adolescence at this point. And while Entrati most likely believed he was in control, he should be careful what he fishes for, because on that same note, if the man on the wall has been known to manipulate us to do what it needs, why would this be any different in Albrecht's case? I very much worry that his need to make things right allowed him to accept his horrific experimentation, gross neglect of those around him, and even rampant time manipulation as a kind of necessary evil, or somehow worse than that. He's just become so consumed with his mission, he's no longer able to allow for such discussion, the ends justifying the means in its purest form. And if that information was given because his adversary knew what he would do with it, if he agreed and created the very champion Albrecht's plot requires, does it not make everything even more perilous? In my opinion, there's always been a heavy influence of Carl Jung's concept of the shadow self within Warframe's story the minute dialogue choices were implemented, mainly because of the nature of what was being offered. These were never good, bad, or neutral ideas, more so basic mindsets that, judging from my understanding, align much more with the idea of assimilation or consummation with this perceived entity, the second being more passive and introspective, and the final being a kind of compromise. And I think it speaks to the fundamental challenge we all face. Our greatest enemy is now and will always be ourselves. And what makes this so terrifying is, even when we are able to understand and identify the information our shadow is supposedly trying to sell us, many times this aspect of our psyches, of everyone's psyche, becomes even more dangerous. Entrati and the Tenno being in the dark about the true nature of their connection to the void is one thing, but Entrati's consistent questioning of this fact would by default make that side of him aware that he knows, and would most likely begin to find other methods of manipulation. Anyone who's had the privilege or perhaps peril of understanding their own shadow's existence will at some point come to understand acknowledgement to be only the first step, and a dangerous one at that. Because now, that voice in your head, well, it knows you know. And it already knows everything about you, because it's you. The difference? You've only learned of its reality, and I think this is a concept Entrati was wise enough to get.
The same cursed question still pursued me as it had before. Was I, even now, trapped in the rictus of the wall? The apparatus of logic would never yield an answer. Only resolute action remained. If I must be a demon, let me be an honest one. Let me prove my nature by what I do next. Purpose. Let me leave such blazing footprints behind me as no unclean thing would dare to walk in.
He can't win in the traditional sense, and he accepts this, alluding to or providing as much information as possible to convey the idea of attempting to escape to presumably a time before the void had ever held sway, but without uttering the specifics, most likely in a desperate attempt to this time close it. His original thoughts, or perhaps make it so it never opened in the first place. And while on the surface this may appear to be a good idea, maybe the only plausible idea, the void doesn't seem intent on just letting things happen, and perhaps through our connection and being through the Drifter, the Tenno, or even one of us outside the game itself, we are being led to believe it is getting closer to its goal, and I'm near certain that this is just what it wants us to think. Make no mistake, Albrecht Entrati is, at least at this stage, no intellectual slouch, a product, I'm guessing, of more than just his own innate skill, but rather a combination of void power, his own intellect, rigorous and horrific experimentation, and communion, his own chilling brand of experience. And from this, he probably realized that he would not be enough. This presence is too calculating, too intelligent, and most importantly, listening to every thought Entrati has. So he would have to attempt to move through time, much in the same way the aforementioned Tyler Durden went through cities, plotting. In fact, if there was in any way a method he developed or just stumbled upon of knowing when he was completely shielded from its presence, maybe even through a created device, it's not like that type of technology would be out of his reach, and utilizing those specific moments, moving all the pieces he felt were necessary, the warrior with the most unique of abilities, unfettered from the same constraints of all others, housed within his fortress, Duviri. I have to question how Albert would even know Duviri existed if the Tenno actually created it in the first place. What could possibly lead him there? What could make him even believe a place such as this could exist? Was he just doing a rough scan of anything in the void and happened to come across such a unique place? Well, the verbiage of one of Entrati's notes.
I could not confront, even in semblance, the woman I had abandoned. Instead, I reinvented myself as a teacher, advising the Child King of the menace beyond his borders. But as the days melted away, I came to recognize the strange cast of characters Euleria had created and their purpose. I heard voices I had myself first conjured in the darkness of her childhood chambers, for no other reward than her delight. She had not only preserved this gift I had thought so trivial, she had made it an instrument of healing. More, a stronghold.
Makes it very possible that Duviri isn't a creation of the Drifter, rather a place he went to. To me, this passage in particular insinuates that the voices he hears in Duviri are the very ones Albert created when preparing Euleria for bed. This place, with her voice as the narrator and anchor, full of characters she was exposed to as a child, and further described very conclusively by Entrati himself, suggests it was she who created Duviri. While the aforementioned passage has been largely interpreted to be metaphoric or symbolic, the way he describes this is more literal and certainly not how one would describe a child's book. Further, how would the Drifter, seemingly just another Tenno on board the Zariman, be able to create this world and give characters voices he or she would not have themselves heard? It's not like Eulalia could mimic Albrecht's voice verbatim. The tone and pitch of each of them are pretty night and day. So now remember what Eulalia informs us of during the New War specifically, one meant to shed light on this situation as a whole. This is exactly what happens to the Tenno if you think about it. They exist in two forms. The Tenno was trapped, the Tenno was saved. And it makes me question Eulalia's involvement, whether she too was involved in his greater scheme, whether she knew that she was involved. Perhaps Eulalia even intended this place to be one that could be visited by students at some point, but just never had the chance, of course, as its divine purpose, at least as Entrati visualized, was to prepare and create a loose stitch in the fabric of reality. As mentioned before, while I can't be certain Entrati had a hand in encouraging the Zariman 10-0 and presumably what should have been the Orokin's prized people to make such a disastrous and quite frankly risky move with such an important group, not because the Orokin cared about, well, any of them, but rather because this group would have been the ones to build Tau, the executors and highest elites of the Orokin Empire's future home, up to their very lofty standards. The idea of a group of these individuals living in anything but the finest the system could offer would well be most likely considered blasphemy in its own right. So, while the Zariman people's goal was to colonize, they were invariably the workforce who would prepare Tau for their anxious golden lords. But it would also provide him the unique opportunity to present the Void with this offering. Many, in fact. It only needed to choose at this point. I think Entrati knew which one it would choose based on his meddling with eternalism. At some point, I think we're going to find that Entrati didn't make his deal in his first encounter with the Void, and the deal was for the Tenno's creation. I believe it's the reason our Tenno's class has curiously changed from what should have been Phasics, literally minutes before jump time, that continued to move, offering the students time to literally answer 3 questions. 3. Aside from explaining to us, the player, the theme of the quest, would this not appear to be a final reminder of how to act in the presence of what was about to occur? And it's interesting that the Tenno, the Void will end up making a deal with, are much more calm, reserved, and capable than what it appears the Drifter goes through in the same situation. And now, having his paradox, Entrati could offer the Void our newly eternalistic Tenno, with the idea that this individual would willingly take a deal because of his apparent need to protect those around him, giving him 2 individuals that could exchange places and still wield the Void, but with the benefit of one being unstained by it. Remember, this was a deal after all, so for Entrati's part, he bartered the Tenno's future light, their innocence, or perhaps even their soul, for the gifts they would be given, or for at least the power he would require. And it even appears the Tenno's delivery will apparently come later, something the Lotus herself alludes to. The bill coming due, at least in his mind. Now, while Entrati would have absolutely none of the Tenno, given the time period of when he first discovered the Void, I believe he is introducing Ballas's Warframe technology into the timeline sooner than it would have happened in its former natural progression. And worse than that, we once again are witness to just another unspeakable act in Entrati's greater good scheme. It's been made quite clear that the Hex have a particular bone to pick with old Dr. E. And while alluded to periodically, we get to see the why within the very pages of a Warframe comic based around the preliminary events of 1999. We come to learn the truth of their own past with Entrati, hired to a suicide mission for the sole purpose of, well, being mortally wounded. Only then could Entrati guarantee that he could milk the juice of their emotional state at death, to produce the void-infused Protoframes we meet in 1999. Not only did he need them to die, But he shows off just a bit of his capabilities when Arthur appears to have him cornered, only to realize Entrati has apparently teleported behind him and worse, has inflicted this mortal wound, all but guaranteeing, if nothing else, at least Arthur, the most important of the hexes, he sees it at least, the transformation he required. In reality, I just can't see any other way of Entrati succeeding in any altruistic method without willingly giving himself to the void and hoping that his pieces do what they are meant to. The Tenno, the Drifter, the Hex, the Holdfast, Teshin, the Lotus, the Vessels. I don't know how many will want to hear this, but even Ballast played his own part in making the Tenno the formidable warriors they have become. And lest we forget, without Ballast, there's no Drifter, validating the very direction the Man in the Wall was giving the Tenno from the beginning of the new war. He wanted Ballast to win because he needed the Drifter to exist, part of the deal. The monkey paw aspect of it is, of course, described in the palm to itself. It willingly agreed to this because it provided a pathway into our reality. It's calculating. So calculating, in fact, that it knows all about Entrati's plan. If you come to the reality that the void and the indifference are intertwined, it makes you question a lot of Entrati's ideas in general, really. Why use a weapon the supposed enemy is by all rights an entity of? The introduction of void infusion to the technocyte virus, especially if this connection exists, would appear to be subject to hostile takeover. The void seems to have no problem utilizing the vessels, the very weapons meant to wage war against it. Further, how does this manipulation into creating the hex as we now understand them affect the vessels? They clearly have a connection of some sort to their human hosts, one that Lloyd's comments is actually initiated by the murmur itself. So the question for all of us is, do you believe? Do you believe in Entrati's plan? Or are you beginning to question the same thing Entrati does? Should we be helping Entrati so willingly? Consider that if we were too late at midnight in Whispers in the Walls, what time did we need to be there? Because technically it wasn't Arthur that was late, right? It was this entity. And the idea of us being led into a trap, much like what happened in the New War, with it potentially already being too late, and the great indifference leading us once more exactly down the path it desires, not just the Tenno, mind you, not just the Drifter, but you too. Did you spread the signal? You didn't do it in game, did you? Your Tenno didn't do it, did they? You did it. How are you accounting for the idea of our characters not necessarily being the people they say? It's certainly a theme we are intended to wrestle with in Warframe 1999. The only question is on how many levels. And with that being said, I hope you enjoyed this video and, well, first understand that this is purely speculation. Given DE's penchant for insane story beats, really anything is possible in the upcoming campaign, but I feel like I've offered quite a bit to ponder while you're at least enjoying it. How many of these questions will get answered? It's tough to say, but I know I can't wait to find out. At any rate, I hope you all have a wonderful day today, a wonderful rest of your week, and I'll talk at you all in the next one. Take care, everybody. Bye.